if you believe that 20 years of a person's life, 20 years of showing up, building, sacrificing, and choosing the same person every single morning, deserves to be honored and not erased by 5 words spoken in a moment of carelessness, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what Steve Harvey said to one husband on this stage is something that needed to be said in front of the entire world. There are sentences that do not function as sentences. They function as verdicts. They arrive not as a contribution to a conversation, but as the closing of one, a door shut on everything that came before it, on every morning and difficult year and quiet act of love that the other person thought was being counted. I wish I never married you. 5 words, spoken by a man named Harold Givens to his wife of 20 years, Cecilia, not in the wreckage of a serious argument, not in a hospital or a courtroom, or any of the places where people say the unsayable because the pressure of circumstance leaves them no other option, but on the Family Feud stage between rounds, in the middle of a conversation with Steve Harvey about what makes a long marriage work. Harold had not planned to say it. That was perhaps the most revealing thing about it. The fact that a sentence of that magnitude could surface without preparation, could arrive as the apparent answer to a direct and generous question, meant that it had not been constructed in that moment. It had been waiting. It had been living somewhere close to the surface for long enough that a simple question had been sufficient to bring it out. Cecilia Givens had given 20 years to a marriage and to a man and to a family. She had given those years with the full investment of a person who did not do things by half measures. And she had heard, in a studio in front of 200 strangers, that the person who had received all of that wished it had never begun. Steve Harvey was standing 3 feet away. He had heard every word, and he was not going to let Harold Givens leave that stage without understanding exactly what he had done. This is what happened next. Harold Givens was 53 years old and had spent the majority of his working life as a corrections officer at a state facility outside of Columbus, Ohio, a profession that had shaped him in ways that were both visible and invisible. Visible in his posture, which retained the alert containment of a man trained to monitor environments for instability. Visible in his communication style, which was direct to the point of being blunt, calibrated more for clarity than for reception. Invisible in the specific emotional toll that 26 years of working inside a correctional environment had accumulated, the secondary weight of proximity to suffering and consequence, and the managed suppression of response that the job required daily. Harold had not talked about that toll with anyone, including Cecilia. He had grown up in a household in Dayton where men carried their difficulties internally and expressed them, if at all, through action rather than language. His father had worked a factory floor for 32 years without once, to Harold's knowledge, describing what it felt like. Harold had inherited that framework with the completeness of a child who never receives an alternative model. He provided for his family. He was physically present. He fixed things when they broke. He showed up. That, in his understanding, was what love looked like in practice, and he had been practicing it consistently for 20 years. What he had never learned to do was say what was actually happening inside him, not the practical facts of his days, which he reported accurately and without omission, but the interior landscape, the accumulation of years, the weight of the work, the specific, unnamed grief of a man who had spent decades surrounded by the consequences of bad choices and had become, in some quiet and unexamined way, afraid of his own. The fear had not translated into anything visible. It had translated into distance, a gradual, consistent withdrawal from the emotional register of the marriage, conducted without announcement, until the distance had become the dominant feature of their domestic life. Cecilia Givens was 50 years old and had worked as a dental hygienist for 18 years before transitioning, 3 years prior, into a practice management role at the dental group where she had built her career. She was organized, warm, professionally respected, and possessed of the particular emotional intelligence of a person who had spent nearly 2 decades in close physical proximity to people at their most vulnerable, seated, reclined, unable to speak, trusting someone they barely knew with the most uncomfortable intimacies of their physical health. She had learned to read people with precision, to anticipate anxiety, to offer reassurance in the specific register that the specific person in front of her required. She had become, over the years, exceptionally good at caring for people who did not know how to ask for care. She had applied those same skills to her marriage. The quiet, persistent, attentive practice of attending to Harold, noticing when the withdrawal deepened, adjusting her approach, finding the small openings that his guardedness occasionally allowed, and using them gently rather than pressing hard enough to close them again. She had done this for 20 years with the dedication of a person who had committed to it completely and who continued to believe, in the face of considerable evidence that the commitment was not equally shared, that the right approach, applied with sufficient patience, would eventually reach him. Their daughter Simone, 24, had submitted the Family Feud application as a birthday gift to her mother, chosen specifically because Cecilia had mentioned once, casually, that she had always wanted to be on the show. Their son Andre, 21, had agreed with the easy enthusiasm of a young man who enjoyed competition in any form. Cecilia's younger sister Paulette completed the team, her presence on stage providing a witness who would later become significant. Harold had agreed to come because Simone had asked him and because he loved his daughter. He had walked onto that stage intending to play a game show, support his family, and return home. He had not walked onto that stage intending to say the 5 words that would force the most honest conversation of his marriage to occur under studio lights, on camera, in front of the world. But that is what happened, and it began, as most consequential things do, with a question that seemed, on the surface, entirely ordinary. Beat 1T. A family that looked complete, the Givens family presented on stage, with the particular warmth of families where the children are the emotional connective tissue, where the love between parents and children is visibly real and generates an energy that can, for a time, make the space between the parents themselves less apparent. Simone was vivid and enthusiastic, clearly the architect of the occasion, and determined to make it everything she had envisioned. Andre was competitive and funny in the quick, physical way of young men who have grown up athletic. Paulette brought the sharp, irreverent humor of a woman who had been the younger sister her whole life and had developed wit as a survival strategy. Harold was cordial and composed on the outside, greeting Steve with a firm handshake, answering the introductory questions with brief competence, producing a smile when the audience expected one. Cecilia was warm and genuine, laughing easily at Steve's opening banter, her professional ease with people translating naturally to the environment. To the 200 people in the studio audience, they looked like a solid, intact family having a good time together. The game opened well. The Givens family moved through the first 2 rounds with the coordinated efficiency of people who knew each other well. Harold fast on the buzzer, Cecilia accurate with her contributions, Simone and Andre feeding each other answers with the telepathic shorthand of siblings. They built a comfortable lead and moved into the 3rd round with the momentum of a family headed toward the final round. Steve Harvey was working the room between rounds with his customary ease, drawing out the texture of the family's life, finding the details that made a group of 5 people feel real to an audience. He turned to Harold and Cecilia with the warm, direct curiosity he brought to long marriages, and he asked the question that the show asked 100 times a season, and that had, until that moment, never produced an answer quite like this one. Beat 25 words and what they cost. Harold, 20 years with this woman, 20 years. What does a marriage like that teach you about yourself? It was a generous question. It was designed to produce reflection, perhaps a little wisdom, the kind of answer that made audiences feel warmly toward a couple who had built something lasting. It was an invitation to say something good. Harold looked at Steve. He looked at Cecilia. And then something moved across his face. A brief, complex expression that was not anger and was not cruelty, but was some combination of exhaustion and unprocessed feeling and the momentary failure of the internal editing that had kept those things contained for most of his adult life. Honestly, Steve, I'm not sure it taught me what I thought it would. There are times I look back at where I was at 30 and I think, if I'd known then what I know now, I might have made different choices. I wish I never married you. Cecilia, That's the honest truth of it. I wish I'd had more time to figure out who I was before I settled down, he said it looking at her. Not with malice, with the flat, confessional delivery of a man who had mistaken the absence of anger for the absence of harm, who believed that because he was not shouting, what he was saying was simply honest rather than devastating. The studio went to the specific silence that precedes a collective understanding. Not the held breath of surprise, but the held breath of recognition. The sound of 200 people simultaneously grasping that what they had just heard was not a game show moment. It was something real and unretractable and irreversible, said in a room with cameras and witnesses and a microphone that had caught every syllable with perfect clarity. Cecilia's expression did not collapse. It changed. A shift so small and so precisely controlled that only the people who knew her face well would have seen it. Paulette saw it. She was standing 2 positions away from her sister, and she saw it, and what she saw made her close her eyes for exactly 1 second before she opened them again and looked at Harold with an expression she did not attempt to conceal. Simone had gone completely still. The brightness that had characterized her from the moment the family took the stage had left her face, with the sudden completeness of a light being switched off. She was looking at her father with the expression of a young woman who has just heard something she cannot unhear, in a place she cannot leave, in front of people she cannot explain it to. Harold, having said it, seemed to register. A beat later than the room had registered. What he had said. He did not reach to take it back. He looked at Steve with the stubborn composure of a man who had committed to a truth and would not dishonor it by retreating from it, even as some part of him understood that what he had called truth was in fact a much more complicated thing. Beat 3. What Steve saw in Cecilia's face. Steve Harvey had seen many things on that stage over many years. He had seen joy and embarrassment and genuine grief, and the specific light that comes into a person's eyes when they are seen and appreciated by someone with a platform. He had learned to read the room with the precision of a man whose entire career had been built on understanding, in real time, what people needed from the space he occupied. What he saw in Cecilia Givens's face was not what he expected. He expected pain, and the pain was there, contained but present. What he did not expect was the absence of surprise. Cecilia had not flinched, she had not gasped. She had absorbed the words with the controlled intake of someone receiving a blow they had been partially braced for, not because she had been told this before in these exact words, but because she had sensed the substance of it in the accumulated silences and small withdrawals of 20 years, and had arrived in some private way at the understanding that the words might eventually come. The fact that she was not surprised was the most telling thing Steve Harvey had observed in a very long time, and it told him something specific, that what Harold had said in 5 words on a game show stage was not new information in Cecilia's marriage. It was, for the first time, spoken information, and the distinction between those 2 states, between a truth that is felt and a truth that is finally said, was the distinction that Steve was not willing to let pass without acknowledgement. He set the game card down. He turned to Harold with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had decided that whatever happened next in this studio, it was not going to be a return to the game. Harold, I need to stop right here. Not to embarrass you. I need to stop because I think something just happened in this room that is more important than this game, and I think you may not fully understand what it is yet. Beat 4. The confrontation that did not look for a villain. What distinguished Steve Harvey's confrontation of Harold Givens from the confrontations of previous episodes in the series was the nature of his approach. With other husbands, the issue had been carelessness, or control, or the management of information. With Harold, Steve recognized something more specific and more difficult, a man who was not cruel, not dismissive, not operating from superiority, but who was profoundly disconnected from the impact of his own interior. A man whose emotional vocabulary had been so thoroughly suppressed by profession and upbringing that he genuinely did not understand the difference between saying something honest and saying something that caused harm. Steve did not treat him as a villain. He treated him as a man who needed to hear something he had never been told. Harold, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear the question carefully before you answer it. When you said those words to your wife just now, when you said you wish you had never married her, were you trying to hurt her? Harold met his gaze. No, he said. I was being honest. I understand, Steve said, and that is exactly what I want to talk to you about, because there is a difference, a significant one, between honesty and harm, and a man can deliver harm while believing he is delivering honesty if he has never been taught to understand the difference. He paused. You said you wish you had never married her. I want to ask you to think about what those words meant to Cecilia. Not what you intended them to mean, but what they meant to her. She has given you 20 years. 20 years of showing up, raising your children, building a household, standing beside a man whose job brings him into contact with some of the hardest things human beings do to each other, and carrying whatever that has cost him, quietly, because he did not know how to say what it cost. She has done all of that, and what you just told her, in front of all these people, is that you wish none of it had started. That the foundation of everything she has built her adult life around is something you regret. Harold had not moved. He was listening with the particular stillness of a man who is hearing something accurate. I do not think you meant that, Steve said. I think you meant something smaller and more specific, that you wish you had known yourself better before you got married, that you carry some grief about the version of yourself you did not get to be. That is a real thing, and it deserves to be talked about. But what you said is not that. What you said is something else entirely, and your wife is standing right here, and she heard every word. Beat 50. Cecilia speaks. Steve turned to Cecilia with the careful gentleness the moment required. Cecilia, I want to give you the full space of this room if you want it. Cecilia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the quality of someone who has decided to be completely honest, rather than diplomatic. Not because diplomacy had failed her, but because she had determined, in the minutes since Harold spoke, that she was no longer willing to use it in this particular situation. I have known that Harold is unhappy for a long time, she said. I have not known the full shape of it, but I have known it, and I have spent a great deal of our marriage trying to be enough to change it, trying to be patient enough, present enough, understanding enough, trying to be the thing that made him feel that the choice he made was the right one. She paused. What I heard today is that 20 years of trying was not sufficient, and I want to say, clearly, so that Harold can hear it, and so that our children can hear it, that I am not angry. I am not performing composure. I am genuinely not angry, because I think Harold just told the truth for the first time in our marriage about something he has never told the truth about before. And I would rather have the truth, however it feels, than continue living inside the version of our marriage where I keep trying to reach something that is not there. She looked at Harold directly, and what was in her eyes was not hatred and was not love in the romantic sense, but was the steady, clear-eyed regard of a woman who had decided she was finished with pretense. I deserve to hear that from you privately, years ago, in our home, where we could have done something about it. Not here, not like this, but here we are. So here is what I am going to say. I am glad it is out. I am sad it took this long, and I need you to look at your daughter. She did not look at Simone when she said it. She kept her eyes on Harold. But Harold looked, and when he did, he saw his daughter's face. The brightness gone, the celebration that Simone had built this day around entirely dismantled, replaced by an expression that no parent who loves their child can observe without consequence. It was that look, his daughter's face, not his wife's words, not Steve Harvey's confrontation, but the face of the child he had raised, that finally reached the place inside Harold Givens that everything else had not yet touched. Harold Givens did not speak immediately. He stood in the difficulty of the moment with the stoic physical stillness of a man who had spent his career standing inside difficult situations, and then something in that stillness changed in a way that the audience could see before he had said a single word. He looked at Simone for a long time, at whatever was on her face, at what his words had done to the birthday gift she had given her mother, at the celebration she had spent weeks organizing that he had dismantled in 30 seconds. And then he looked at Cecilia, And whatever calculation had been running in him, whatever version of himself he had been protecting by keeping his interior life sealed, appeared to reach its conclusion. Cecilia. His voice was rougher than it had been. The corrections officer's containment was intact in his posture, but had left his voice, which was lower and unguarded in a way that it had not been since he had taken the stage. What I said was wrong. Not wrong because it was honest. I meant what I said about wishing I had known myself better. But I said it in a way that erased you, in a way that told you that 20 years of your life, 20 years of everything you have given to this family, to me, to our children, were a mistake. And they are not a mistake. You are not a mistake. What I carry is mine. It has nothing to do with you. And I have let you believe for years that it did because I did not know how to separate those two things. I am sorry. I am deeply sorry, not for being honest, but for 20 years of directing something at you that was never about you. He stopped. He started again and his voice was quieter. I have been carrying something from my work for a very long time that I have never told you about. I have never told you what it costs me. I have never told you what I bring home that I pretend I leave at the gate. I have told myself that protecting you from it was the right thing. I think today, I understand that protecting you from it was actually protecting me. And you deserved better than that. You have always deserved better than that. Cecilia looked at him for a long time. The measurement in her eyes was thorough and unhurried, the assessment of a woman who had spent 2 decades developing expert-level knowledge of one person and was applying all of it to this moment. That is the most you have said to me in 20 years, she said quietly. Not as accusation, as plain a fact. I needed to hear it. I have needed to hear it for a very long time. Steve Harvey, watching the exchange, gave it the full space it required before he spoke. When he addressed the cameras, his voice carried the weight of genuine conviction rather than performance. What Harold just did. I want to be clear about what it was. He did not simply apologize for saying something careless. He identified the root of it. He named the thing underneath the words. The years of unexpressed weight, the misdirected pain, the silence that had been aimed at a person who deserved explanation rather than distance. That is not easy to do. That requires a level of self-examination that most people avoid their entire lives because the examination is uncomfortable and the findings are difficult to sit with. He paused. I want every man watching who has been carrying something from his work, from his past, from whatever it is that his framework did not teach him to express. I want that man to understand something. The silence is not strength. The silence is a weight your partner carries for you without being told what it is or why they are carrying it. They feel it. They adjust to it. They build their entire experience of the marriage around it without ever being told its name. And they deserve the name. They have always deserved the name. Giving them the name is not weakness. It is the thing that makes a marriage real rather than managed. He looked at Cecilia. Cecilia Givens showed us tonight what 20 years of patient, persistent, unacknowledged love looks like when it is finally given the honest response it has always been owed. She did not collapse. She did not perform. She told the truth about what she needed and she waited, in front of all of us, to see if he was capable of meeting it. And he was. That matters. It matters enormously. What traveled and where the episode aired on a Friday evening. By Saturday morning, 2 phrases had separated from the clip and were circulating through different but overlapping communities with notable speed. The first was Harold's apology, specifically the line, "I have let you believe for years that it was about you, and it was never about you," which traveled through spaces populated by people in professions with high emotional labor demands: first responders, correctional workers, healthcare professionals, military personnel, and their partners. The response in those spaces was not simply appreciative. It was recognitional, the specific, exhaled recognition of people who had either been Harold or been married to Harold, and who had never heard the dynamic named so precisely. The second phrase that traveled was Cecilia's, "That is the most you have said to me in 20 years," which circulated through a broader and more varied audience as a quiet, devastating articulation of what emotional unavailability actually looks like from the inside of a long marriage. Not dramatic, not a crisis, simply a measurement. A woman counting something that had been insufficient for 2 decades and stating the count plainly, without embellishment, in a way that required no further explanation. Steve's address to men carrying unexpressed weight, his distinction between silence as strength and silence as a transferred burden, was shared extensively by marriage counselors and therapists, particularly those working with clients in high-stress professions where emotional suppression is occupationally normalized. Several practitioners noted publicly that the clip had done in 4 minutes what some of their clients had spent years in session working toward: the identification, by the man himself, of the internal origin of a behavior he had been enacting without examination. What changed in the Givens marriage? The follow-up interview, conducted 5 months after the episode aired, found Harold and Cecilia in a state that was neither the triumphant reconciliation of a television narrative nor the quiet dissolution of a marriage that had reached its limit. It was something more honest than either. A marriage in active reconstruction, attended to with the seriousness that both parties now understood it required. Harold had entered individual therapy within 2 weeks of returning from Los Angeles. Specifically, a practitioner experienced in working with correctional professionals on the secondary trauma of long-term exposure to institutional environments. He had attended 8 sessions by the time of the interview. He described the experience with the cautious, precise language of a man who had not previously had a vocabulary for this domain and was building one carefully. "I did not understand that what I brought home from work was a form of grief," he said. "I understood it as toughness, as something you managed. My therapist described it differently, and the description was more accurate and more useful, and I am still adjusting to it." Cecilia spoke about the post-episode period with the frank clarity that had characterized her statement on stage. The conversation that had begun under studio lights had continued at home, not in a single, conclusive exchange, but across a series of smaller, harder, more specific conversations that were slowly filling in the 20 years of interior life that Harold had not previously shared. "It is like receiving correspondence that was sent a long time ago," she said. "Some of it is difficult to read. All of it is useful. I would rather have it now than not at all." She was direct about the work that remained. They were in couples counseling. The marriage was not repaired. It was, she said, being rebuilt, which was a different process and a slower one. She was not performing optimism, but she was also, for the first time in years, operating with full information, and that, the restoration of informed choice, was the thing she returned to most often when asked how she was doing. Simone's reckoning of everyone in the Givens family. Simone had carried the episode with the particular weight of a person who had created the occasion. In the follow-up segment, she spoke with honesty that was notable for its lack of self-pity. "I submitted that application because I wanted to do something that would make my mother happy," she said. "I thought a day on a game show would be that. I was wrong about what kind of day it would be, but I was right that it was something my mother needed. She needed the truth to be in a room that was too public to manage. I did not plan that, but looking back, I think it is what had to happen." She was quiet for a moment before adding something that stayed with everyone who heard it. "My father loves my mother. I have never doubted that. What I watched on that stage was a man who had never been taught to show it correctly, in a moment where he could not avoid seeing what the absence had cost. I think that moment was necessary. I think some things can only be learned that way, in public, under pressure, when there is nowhere left to retreat to. I am sorry my mother had to go through that. I am glad my father finally did." Steve Harvey on the Silence Men Carry asked in a subsequent interview what had moved him most about the Givens exchange. Steve Harvey spoke with the considered directness that characterized his most personal observations. "Harold's second statement," he said, "not the first apology, the second part, where he talked about what he carries from his work and has never told his wife. That is not specific to corrections officers. That is specific to men who were raised to contain difficulty rather than express it. I know that man. I have been a version of that man. The belief that silence protects the people you love. It is genuinely held. It is not cynical. These men believe they are being strong. They do not understand that the silence lands in the marriage as distance, and the person on the receiving end of the distance has no explanation for it, and builds explanations of their own, and most of those explanations are about themselves rather than about the truth. He paused. The most useful thing a man in Harold's position can do is say the name of what he carries. Not the whole story, not immediately, not all at once, just the name. Just, I bring something home from this work, and I have not known how to tell you what it is. That sentence alone changes the architecture of the marriage, because it takes the unexplained distance and gives it an address. And once it has an address, the partner can stop blaming themselves for a problem that was never theirs to solve. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the episode's air date, Cecilia posted a photograph on her personal social media account. It was taken by Simone. The two of them were not in it. The photograph showed Harold sitting at their kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of him, speaking to someone off camera with the particular quality of expression that belongs to a man who is saying something real and difficult and is not retreating from it. Cecilia had captioned it simply, in the plain direct voice she used for everything that mattered. 1 year ago, 5 words ended 20 years of silence. I would not recommend the method. I am grateful for the result. He is learning to talk. I am learning to believe what I hear. That is enough for now. That is more than enough. The post was shared over 700,000 times. Harold commented beneath it, 20 years late, not 1 day more. Simone commented, this is the birthday gift I actually meant to give. Steve Harvey, tagged by thousands of followers who wanted him to find it, replied with one line, Harold, Cecilia. The silence is over. Now the marriage begins. If this story reminded you that the silence men carry is never as protective as they believe, and that naming it is the beginning, not the end, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every like and subscribe helps us bring you more real stories about real people, real marriages, and the moments that change everything. Hit the bell so you never miss one.